Welcome back, everyone. This is the Big Lebowski, and today's subject will be covering something that is a little more sensitive in nature, such as cannibalism, more graphic, and so viewer discretion is advised. But of course, for everyone else, go ahead and brew up a cup of your favorite beverage, and let's dive right in. History of cannibalism. Human cannibalism is the act or practice of humans eating the flesh or internal organs of other human beings. Cannibalism has been well documented in much of the world, but in today's video, I'm going to keep it centered closer to home in the Pacific Islands. Cannibalism was prevalent across most of the Pacific Islands, but the most commonly recorded places were Fiji, once nicknamed the Cannibal Isles, the Maori people of New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, where some isolated areas still continue this practice, and in parts of the Solomon Islands. Cannibalism was also present here in the Samoa Islands. Stories and recordings speak of a cannibal king named Tui Fe'ai, but that's a story for another video. While some think cannibalism would only show up under dire circumstances, such as famines and other prolonged instances of little to no food, for some of these islands, it was a common way of life. The island peoples would also commonly convert this into stories, and for Samoans, this came in the form of the Sau'ai, Tui Letafu'e. There aren't any recordings stating how tall he was exactly, but only that he was a large man, some would even consider him a giant, that lived in a large house, and that he was a man-eater. There is only one legend where this giant appears, and it also features a girl named Sina, in what can only be described as one of many instances of implied bestiality in Samoan lore, but don't worry, I won't show that here. So, the story goes that Sina was the last child and only daughter of a couple that lived by the ocean. So, every day, her and her brothers, who were all named Tui, would chase underneath these birds that would fly from the shore to the forest every day. But the one who loved these birds the most was their sister, Sina. And so what Sina would do is she would wake up before everybody, head down to the waters, and watch how these birds would fly from shore all the way to the forest. And then one day she noticed that these birds, usually they had really dark feathers or they were like completely black. She noticed that one of them was completely white, which was very rare. And because of this, she just couldn't take her eyes off of it. She watched it dip and swoop and glide around like all the other birds, except that it shimmered in the sunlight because of the reflection of the light on it. And so what ends up happening is this bird swoops down towards her. She tries to catch it. It flies back up, and it does this a couple of times, and then soon it's the only bird that's with her. And she becomes so smitten by this bird that she actually falls in love with it. And no, it's not like some demigod or it's some like Maui figure. It's just a straight up bird. But then, of course, this bird ends up flying off into the forest like the rest of them, and she just starts weeping uncontrollably because this bird is gone. So all her brothers hear this and they come running out. They're like, "What's wrong? What's happening?" And she's just like, "Oh, the love of my life, this bird just flew away without me." So all of her brothers are like, "Okay." And they're like, "Well, won't you just see it again?" And she's like, "No, if I never get this bird, if I don't marry this bird, I will never find happiness in my life," which is a little dramatic. But of course, all the boys look at each other and they're like, "Well, we love our sister. She's the only sister that we have. We're going to try to find it, even though what she's asking for is pretty unreasonable." And they tell her as much. They're like, "All right, we're going to head out. We're going to try to find this bird. Just promise us you will stay home. And if you get hungry, there's food on the top shelf." So, of course, she immediately springs up and she's like, "Oh, my brothers love me. Okay." She goes home and she waits for them. So the boys head out and they climb mountains, they cross rivers, they go down into the valley deep, and they still can't find this bird. So she ends up waiting and she's thinking it's going to be this really quick errand that they run, but they don't return home for a very long time. So she starts getting very hungry and she starts getting really worried about her brothers. And so, of course, as more time passes, she's starting to forget about this bird and she's starting to wonder, like, are they okay? Should I go look for them? And I'm getting really hungry. She immediately forgets that there's food on the top shelf, like they had said, and she starts heading out towards the forest. And as she's passing, fruit trees, she picks from the trees and she's eating them. And she's like calling out to her brothers. And since all of them have the same name, all she's doing is saying like, Tui and Tui and Tui and Tui, where are you guys? But they're not in the area, so of course they don't hear her. But she keeps walking further and further into the forest, and she doesn't realize that there is a Tui that's listening to her. It's just not one of her Tuis. The Tui that ends up listening is what we call a Sau'ai. And a Sau'ai is a large evil spirit, or the spirit of a giant that eats people. And his name is Tui Letafue. So he's been watching her the entire time she's been in this forest because he lives there. And then he notices, like, this is too easy. She's such easy prey. So he hides out of sight and he answers her. And he says, "Oh, I'm right here. Just come closer." And so, of course, she thinks nothing of it. And she's like, "Oh, it's one of my brothers." And so she trods along, she gets closer, and the closer she gets to the spot, she starts to realize, oh, this is probably not a good idea. And as soon as she has that thought, his hands are already closing around her. And he grabs her and she starts struggling against him. And he's a very, very strong man. Now, he's described as more of like a beast or a being than a man. But of course, it was very anthropomorphic. So he has a lot of human features. He's incredibly hairy and he's very akin to a giant. So they have immense strength, which is common. But picks her up and he's like, "That was the easiest meal of my life." And they start heading over to his house. And all this while, all she's thinking is I should have stayed home. I should have listened to my brother. And of course, the closer they get to the house, the more hopeless she feels. Because they're heading far away from home. Her brothers don't know she's gone. And she's getting very worried. So they get to the giant's house. He sets her down in the center. And he tells her, "I'm not going to eat you. You're going to sit here and look through my hair for lice. And I'm going to make you my wife," because he realizes that she is exceedingly beautiful. So, of course, when she hears that, she thinks this is a fate worse than death. It'd be better if he ate me. But then, she loses strength in her legs and she ends up sitting down. And then he puts his giant head on her legs to keep her from moving. And she starts looking for lice in his hair. And what she noted is that his hair was so thick and so coarse, it was like having woven fabric or having woven threads because of how thick each strand was. So, of course, it pans back to her brothers, and her brothers come in with all sorts of white birds. They're all bringing them. They're like, "We got it, boys. We got the bird." But each of them, of course, have a different type of white bird. So when they all see it, they're like, "That's not the right one. This is the right one." Of course, when they walk into the house and don't see their sister, all of them are immediately like, "Of course, she didn't listen, and we have to go find her." So they bolt back into the forest, each of these brothers looking at different spots. But only the youngest ends up finding these deep indentations from a very, very heavy person that was walking through the forest. So he follows it back, and then he comes to the giant's home, and when he sees it, he starts to hear his sister, who she had decided, since she can't call for her brothers because the giant was there, she was going to sing. And when she was singing for her brothers and she was combing through the giant's hair, the giant fell asleep. But since he's sleeping on her leg, she can't get out. So when her little brother comes in and he hears this, he answers back and asks her, like what she's doing. So she's able to relay to him in a song that the giant is sleeping on my legs, and that's the reason I can't get out. So of course the little brother's looking around and he's thinking about it, and he's like, what can I do to help free my sister? Then he notices that this giant not only has very strong threads of hair in the locks of his hair, it's super long, like so long that it looked like it was just splayed out across the entire floor of his giant home. So what ends up happening is he gets all of these and he starts wrapping them and braiding them around each and every one of these poles. And then he gives his sister a look and tells her, on my mark, you're going to get up and we're going to run. And then he's like, okay, ready, go. And she gets up and she goes with her brother and they book it. And they try to run as far as they can. And then they stop and they look back to where the giant's house was. And they see that the giant has stopped his snoring and he's starting to stir. And of course the giant, he's waking up and he's like, the singing has stopped, she's not touching my hair anymore, I don't feel her legs under my head. And he moves his head to try to see what's going on, and he feels it tug. And so he tries to move it the other way and he feels it tug again. And then he the giant gets up alert, and then he starts trying to violently move his head to move and get free from what he thinks is someone pulling his hair. That he stands up suddenly. Not only do some of his hair rip out of his skull, he's so strong it ends up pulling all of the poles in, kind of like the biblical reference of Samson, how he topples over all of these things, and then the house collapses in on him and kills him instantly. And as soon as the siblings see this, they're like, we did it, we're done. So they, of course, their victory walk, they go home, they meet up with the brothers, they tell them what happened, and Sina just comes to realize, hey, it wasn't a cool thing for me to ask my brothers to go and try to find this bird. It was very selfish of me. And of course she realizes her love for her brothers, and she thanks them, and they live happily ever after. But in another version of this, after they save her from the giant, she literally has the boys go find this bird again. And they go and they find the bird and they bring it back. And not only does she love the bird, apparently this bird falls in love with her as well. And they end up getting married. But that's the legend of Sina and the giant.